to this first debate in our strand called Feminism and its Discontents. This session is called Rape Culture, Menace or Myth. My name's Luke Gittos. I'm the law editor for Spiked Online, and I've written a book called Why Rape Culture is a Dangerous Myth, so you know where I stand. But you don't want to hear from me. We've got a fantastic panel to discuss this issue. First to speak will be Ian Dunt. Ian's the editor of politics.co.uk, which is a fantastic magazine. I recommend you check it out, covering all sorts, covering everything, I think, pretty much. And you're a reporter in Westminster as well. It's sort of the day job, is that right?
Yeah, indeed.
Great. And he's also a very nice guy. Second to speak after Ian will be Dr. Kaitlynn Mendes. Kaitlynn is a researcher in feminism and media at the University of Leicester, and she's the author of SlutWalks, Feminism, Activism and the Media. Third to speak will be Sue Edwards from the University of Buckingham. Sue is a professor of law, an author of a number of books, one entitled Gender and the Legal Process. And
you missed off the sex, that's important.
Oh.
Sex and gender in the legal process.
Typical. So gender, sex and the legal process. I have to say a particular thank you to Sue because the speaker who's advertised in the brochure couldn't make it. So it's appropriate that we airbrush him from history, forget he ever existed, and thank you very much, Sue, for attending this morning and filling in the gaps. And then last to speak will be Christina Sommers, who will be known to many of you in the room as the Factual Feminist, YouTube star, I think it's fair to say, enormous following on Twitter, and is also a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. So thank you very much to all of our panel, and without further ado, Ian, do you want to get us started?
So rape is one of those issues, really, that should be incredibly simple. It should just have one interesting dimension, which is how do we reduce rape and sexual assault? And the fact that it has become so interesting in a variety of other ways means that something is going terribly wrong. The other ways, I think, in which it's become interesting is really twofold. One of them is our general inability as a society to have honest, frank conversations about sex, and that extends most particularly in this case to our inability to deliver effective sexual education classes in schools. And the other is a sort of political symbolism that rape offers, especially within feminism and within student protest movements. On the first, there are signs of our inability to think clearly about this topic and to have educated people clearly, just merely by the fact that the quite serious data indicates that we have 15% of rapes are being reported to the police. That is a very low figure. There are some explanations, of course. Say, well, maybe some women like to deal with this more informally and maybe they don't think it was serious enough. And in some cases that may be true. Nevertheless, that figure suggests that we have a serious problem, that there is a quite significant degree of victim blaming still in our society now, and that some of that victim blaming takes place from women themselves. And you'll quite often, when you speak to women who have clearly been raped, hear things like, well, by that point I'd already taken him home and my top was off, so, I was sort of responsible in some way, as if consent ends at a set point and anything that happens beyond that is no longer the responsibility of the aggressor. So we do have a significant problem there. On the other hand, there is, I think, quite a big problem with the way that this issue has been hijacked by parts of usually campus feminist groups. For instance, with the suggestion that there is some thriving rape culture in university campuses. Now, most of that comes from the Hidden Marks, which is this NUS report from 2010. Very serious commentators bring this report up all the time. I mean, as Luke pointed out consistently in his book, it is utter nonsense. I mean, it's, 2,000, just above 2,000 self-selecting people online. This is not serious research you could credit. And in fact, the information from the States suggests that for the age group going to university, there's actually higher rates of sexual assault outside of campus than there are on campus. It's not to suggest that there is no problem at all. It is that the fixation on this idea of campus as this uniquely dangerous place doesn't have any statistical backing and is triggering a considerable degree of legislative and cultural criticism. So there's this pushing of the idea, for instance, that we can clamp down on songs and on book titles, blurred lines as the obvious response, because of this crisis. So this creation of an engine of moral panic is actually serving a wider sort of censorship agenda. That would not be particularly troubling, really, if it wasn't for the fact that actually I believe that makes sexual assault more likely and harder to defeat. I think it does it in the following ways. When we start seeing mandatory consent classes for students, that seems to me a completely inane and dangerous notion. The problem with people raping is not that they are too stupid to understand what consent is. Consent is not a difficult concept. The problem is that they are bastards, and that is why they commit rape. So you see, for instance, there was a video, just a dreadful video from the States, which was showing a woman who was asleep and a variety of guys in a party having sex with her. And one of the guys said afterwards, well, I didn't understand that was rape. A guy watching said, I didn't understand that was rape because there was no violence. See, I don't believe him. I think he did know exactly what that was, and he chose to do nothing about it because he didn't have the guts, not because he's not intelligent enough to understand consent. Consent classes, to me, do not seem like an answer. More pernicious than that are these consent contracts, which are being handed out in boxes to students, where, you know, just before you have sex, you're supposed to take a photo of the two of you having signed this document. I mean, beyond the fact that that shows no recognition for what human life is actually like, or what we would wish it to be like. It is also very, very dangerous, because, of course, it suggests that in court, if that goes on and the guy actually acts more aggressively, or she decides she doesn't want to do it, or they said they would use a condom and then he decides to go ahead and not, actually in court that'll be used against her, because it's a sign that, you know, she did give consent. Consent is not something that is frozen in a moment of time, from which point on nothing applies. So actually I think some of these developments are extremely pernicious and make it harder to deal with the very, very basic and simple thing of what we need to do with rape, which is, of course, cut down on sexual assaults. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Kaitlynn.
One thing I want to actually start by saying, and this is something maybe we can discuss with the audience, is what is rape culture? And it's really hard to define because I think it's often conflated with lad culture, which is what we often hear talked about as being really rampant upon campuses. So maybe this is something that we can open up to discussion later. But, you know, in trying to kind of provide a broad definition, I would say rape culture is, of course, a culture in which sexual assault is rife. I mean, we have very different statistics, but roughly I think it's about 1 in 4 women, 1 in 5 women, and there are some statistics which indicate it's around 1 in 6 men. Now, we know that these statistics differ depending on the population. For example, women and men from marginalized groups who are, for example, in care, who are from ethnic minorities, they have higher incidences of rape. People of a certain age, so younger people, for example, are more likely to get raped than older people, for example. So rape culture, of course, means that we live in a culture in which sexual assault happens. But for me, when we talk about rape culture, it's about more than that. So it's about the prominence of rape jokes and violence against women, okay, about how these sorts of issues are seen as funny, how they're trivialized, how if you go into Facebook, you can find pages like "beat a bitch up today." Okay, so how this is seen as normal. It's about the rise in pressure for young women to engage in sexting, okay, to take photos of themselves, sexually explicit photos of themselves, and send it to young men. It's about the prevalence of sexual and street harassment. It's about the rise of revenge porn, so ex-partners posting photos of their former partners, sexually explicit photos of themselves online. And I think rape culture also is about sexualized banter. So for me, what underpins rape culture, and what I find really problematic about it, it's male entitlement. I think that's probably the key to it. Yes, some part of rape culture also involves misogyny, the general hatred of women, but I think male entitlement explains a lot of it. So if we think about date rape, or rape that happens between acquaintances, spouses, partners, which is the majority of rape, I don't necessarily think it's always about men trying to punish women or exert violence against women, although that is the case. I think it's because men feel as though they are entitled to women's body. Because the woman went home with the man, she took her top off. So the man thinks, okay, well, you took your top off, that's a sign that I am entitled to your body. Or we went on a date, I bought you dinner, I paid for your drinks. I am therefore entitled to your body. So entitlement is a really key aspect for me of rape culture. So it's not just male entitlement to women's bodies, but also to their time, their affection, and their attention. So street harassment, perhaps, explains this. So men feel as though I can make comments to any woman on the street, and I expect her to respond positively towards them. So if I say hi, hey beautiful, I expect her to respond. Now, perhaps what I also want to say is that I don't think that living in a rape culture means that every man is going to go out and commit rape, okay? And same thing, this entitlement that I'm talking about, I don't think all men feel entitled to women's bodies, their time, and their attention. So we saw this kind of debate played out after the Isla Vista shootings in California, where Elliot Rodger gunned down 6 women. And in the manifesto he left behind, he stated that he wanted to punish women for not giving themselves to him sexually. So there are some cases where some men feel very entitled, but there are lots of other men who don't feel entitled at all. But we know that all women live in a world where this entitlement is real, where they feel pressured to respond to men. And if they don't, there can be some very dire consequences, such as murder, such as assault, such as groping. Okay, so men often feel so entitled to women's bodies that they feel as though they can just grope them whenever they want, in nightclubs, in public transportation. And if women don't respond in a way that men want them to, women are also often subject to verbal abuse. So I don't know how many women in this room can raise their hand and say, you know, a man hit on me, and when I refused him, it went from, hey, beautiful, to, hey, you cunt. Well, you're a bitch, you're ugly, I wouldn't want to fuck you anyways. Okay, that's actually a really, really common response. It also leads to men following women. They feel so entitled to have access to these women that they follow them home. So maybe I just want to finish by saying that there are some very serious implications of living in a rape culture, where harassment and sexual assault are normal parts of everyday life. So one, I think we actually do have an awareness, and this is maybe where I'm going to differ, is I think there is actually a general a lack of awareness of what rape can be. So particularly for women, this is where I agree with you. I think there's a lot of cases where women get raped, and if it's a boyfriend, if it wasn't violent, if it doesn't fit that narrative of a stranger on the street using violence, and I fought against him with all my might, a lot of women don't necessarily recognize that to be rape. And I think it's the same with men. I think men often or sometimes feel entitled. So if it's a girlfriend, if it's someone you've slept with before, when this date rape happens, you know, they just felt entitled to their body, and I don't think they always recognize that it actually was assault. There's also evidence that bystanders don't necessarily recognize what it is. So, and this is maybe where the blurred lines happen, where, okay, we understand if a man penetrating a woman with his penis is rape, but what about if he uses his fingers? Okay, and we saw evidence of this with Steubenville, Ohio, where there was a teenager who was drunk, passed out at a party, her body was kind of transported, and a lot of men penetrated her with her fingers. Well, there were lots of people who took videos of this, who witnessed this, and I think people didn't recognize that that was rape. And so I think that's actually where consent comes in, these consent training comes in. We also have a lot of evidence that people don't take rape and sexual assault seriously, or rape culture seriously. So sexual harassment, well, you should just be grateful for the compliment. He was just trying to say hello. He was just trying to be nice. We know that victim blaming is a key feature of rape culture. And where rape is seen as not only natural, well, men are so innately sexual that sometimes they can't help but, you know, throw themselves at a woman. But it's also seen as inevitable and sometimes excusable. And, you know, maybe this is something we'll pick up on as well, finally, that there are often light sentences for those who are convicted. So I have lots of evidence of cases where men either receive very light sentences or no sentences at all, even in cases where the assault has been filmed, okay, where there was one case in particular, a man drugged and raped his wife and filmed it. She only found out about it because she found the films. The judge convicted him of rape but gave him no jail time and told her that she needed to forgive him in his sentence. So I'll finish there.
Okay, thanks, Kaitlynn. Sue.
Yes, well, there is a rape culture. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Whilst there's an increasing number of women who are more willing to report rape, when we come to look at the conviction rate actually is no different than it was in the 70s. So we can't put our faith in the courts in terms of their ability to protect women. But it's not only the courts that are a great concern. I think we need to be concerned about the continuing representation of women within the media and largely within pornography. It is of some significance, I think, that in 2015 it was passed, a new law was passed that actually regulated violent rape in pornography. And what we've got to look at is the desexualization of the whole of the culture, in the sense that it doesn't see that representations of women in the media and representations of women in film are actually sexualized. So in fact, in a sense, we're becoming desexualized. That's my point. We're becoming desexualized and desensitized to the fact that there's a continuing sexualization that's going on and that is actually affecting all of us in the way in which we respond. I just want to refer to a number of examples. I mean, there was one example going back to 2002 of Madonna's video in Die Another Day. I don't know whether any of you saw this, where Madonna was tied up, writhing in a Latin American prison, being bound and gagged. And the response to that was, what a fabulous video, how erotic that is. And of course, Madonna survives. But as Amnesty International knows, and any other human rights organization knows, these women don't survive. And so there's a continual feeding, whether it's in promotional videos, whether it's in mainstream culture, as well as within pornography, of the sexualization of women, rather in the way that Andrea Dworkin so reputedly put it, that it doesn't matter what you do to her, she will always enjoy it. And that kind of narrative is continually being presented within the media and within mainstream media. So what does that do? Well, what it does in the courtroom, and I'm currently working on looking at strangulation, which in fact, if you look at murders on women and partners, I'm talking about female partners within what we call a domestic violence context, a large proportion of those women are actually strangled. And some of those strangulations are being sexualized, that they are being put forward by defense counsel, although defense counsel acceptably are putting forward the narratives of those who have killed these women. And the argument has been that, in fact, she desired that it heightened sexual libido. And in fact, it's not just death, it's the whole gamut of violence against women where there is an argument, and it's put out there in media, advertising, film industry, as well as in the courtroom, that actually women desire what some people are calling rough sex. And in fact, that is a narrative that is presented from the mouth and the lips and the voice of the perpetrator. And yet again, we see the silencing of women, of women's narratives on this, and we see the extolling, if you like, of the male narrative, that she desired it. One significant case in 2006 was the case of Graham Cutts. It was a case against Graham Cutts, who is now serving a life sentence for murder of Jane Longhurst, and that was precisely his argument. Fortunately, the jury did not accept it and convicted him of murder. So he is serving a life sentence, and that had a change in terms of how it influenced the legislation in terms of looking at the impact of violence in pornography. But in fact, he was an avid viewer of pornography. He'd looked at many sites of strangulation before he went on to kill her. And it's quite clear from my research that I'm currently doing on strangulation in some of these cases that there's a history of strangulation and sexualized strangulation against women. So when we come to look at rape, we have a rape culture, and I'll sum up now before the yellow card rises. I'm told it does. We have a rape culture, and that culture actually still blames women, still holds women responsible for violence against them, still doesn't sufficiently protect them. Actually, few men are convicted. There are the same percentage of men convicted today in the courts as there were back in the 70s. I looked at the statistics. So the conviction rate hasn't improved. In fact, the courtroom discussions in the courtroom and the cross-examination in the courtroom is even more robust, with defense counsel saying, well, you consented even where there is violence, because the argument is that actually women like violence and, quote, unquote, it's rough sex. So in fact, it's more difficult to actually get a conviction. So in fact, looking at my lifetime in this area of research, my PhD actually was on rape several years ago, I don't actually see any real changes in the way in which women are presented, although, of course, there are examples of women's emancipation across a range of areas. I don't see that actually women are represented any differently than they were. The fight is still on, and we do have a rape culture, and I absolutely disagree with the first speaker that it's perhaps not something we should worry too much about. We should worry about it. Worry for our sisters, worry for our daughters, worry for our female partners, worry for our grandchildren, worry for our grandmothers, that in fact we live in a rape culture and women are no longer safe.
Thank you, Sue. And Christina.
We don't live in a rape culture. We live in a culture where it is rife with misinformation, if you will, and propaganda. And we are saturated with propaganda, and it has reached a point where I see now on the campus, and maybe a little bit here on this panel, what I would describe as a kind of moral panic, a contagion of hysteria. It brings to mind, I'm not going to say the Salem witch trials, although on American campuses I would say that I'm seeing, it looks as though I'm seeing the equivalent of accusers of people being accused of witchcraft from which there is no defense. It's a contagion of hysteria, and as with other panics in the past, I would compare it more to the panic over satanic cults in daycare centers in the 1980s. And who would come to the defense of people accused of, using children in diabolical cults, and no one wanted to defend them, and yet it was a completely manufactured crisis promoted by, of course, the media, and in this case, in the daycare center case in the 80s, it started in California. Also, a lot of feminists were involved because it sort of fit the narrative of a kind of feminism of paranoia, that there were these invisible crimes everywhere, pervasive. It was a culture of predation. This is so false. Let's begin to look at the statistics, and then I will take a look at the results of this panic. How many times have you heard 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women are victims of sexual assault? You began to hear this in the late 80s and 90s. The methodology for finding this epidemic was perfected by a professor, Mary Koss. And what she did was, you don't ask people, you don't have a sample of subjects that are representative of the population, and you don't ask direct questions. That's done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which sort of sets the gold standard for research, and I'll tell you what they found in a moment. What Mary Koss did was she would ask sort of vaguely worded questions to a non-representative sample of students and declare a rape crisis. So you don't say, have you been raped, have you been sexual assaulted? You will say things. I mean, it's a mix of questions that I find acceptable, and then questions that are just vague. Have you ever had sex because you didn't want to, because a man gave you alcohol or drugs? And anyone that said yes was counted as a rape victim in her survey. I can imagine cases where that would be rape. We would all agree that it was a horrible violation. But there are cases where you wouldn't know. And I found it very interesting that in her research, the majority of the young women did not think it was a crime, and many of them dated their alleged rapists again. So this is all very, so that alerted me to the problems with this methodology. Now it's used over and over again. People will ask subjects, a non-representative group of subjects, vaguely worded questions, and find an epidemic of assault. What happens when you ask a truly representative sample? And what happens when you are rigorous researchers? When you're from the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the Justice Department in the United States, well, the numbers go down. And you find not only that, but as of, I think, this year or last year, rape, along with most violent crime, is at a 41, 42-year low. And it's not 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, but more like 1 in 50 for college students. Now that is too many. 1 in 50 is too many. But it is not epidemic. It is a serious problem. It is a hateful crime. And I, for one, and I hope I speak for everyone in this room, consider it an abominable crime for which a person should be severely punished. But because it's such a horrible crime, we have to be vigilant and careful about false accusations. And they happen. And we are seeing now, because of these false statistics, and it wasn't just the false statistics, you have this body of egregiously false information at the heart of the campus rape culture crusade, and you have twisted theories. And we had a big fight, and I consider myself a feminist, and I'm a feminist. I was teaching feminist philosophy in the late 80s and early 90s, and there was a big battle within feminism. And our side won the argument, and by our side I mean sort of pro-sex feminists who wanted, saw women as moral agents and equal to men, and we cared a lot about getting the truth about what was going on, and something like young women involved in sexting. As a mother, I don't approve of it, but as a human being, I can imagine these young women, they are not simply molded by the society to send their boyfriends pictures. They might just think it's fun, and these things may just be a phenomenon of freedom. And as far as people engaging on the street, a lot of it can be annoying. But if someone says, hello, beautiful, that depends on who you are. You might like it, or you might resent it. And then there are people who can be very threatening. But to put it all in the same category and not to attend to the fact that there's also a class component. I know in Washington, D.C., there are places you can go and walk, and you would definitely be harassed by the men sitting there. And it's a lot of dressed for success women walking through, and there are homeless men that will call out and say, hi, beautiful, and so forth. So I just don't go along with this idea, but I think this is part of the panic that all manifestations of sexuality are now seen with suspicion. It's part of this invisible crime, and we have the trigger warnings, and we have the women going to safe spaces. And again, as someone who comes from a school of feminism that sees women as agents and the equal to men, and there were people on my side, Camille Paglia and Daphne Patai, Kathy Young, and we thought we won the argument. But the other side quietly took all the assistant professorships. And this paranoid school of sex-phobic feminism, I call it fainting couch feminism, because it's sort of women are constantly being put upon by men, and we must, rush to protect. And when I say this, I am not trivializing in any way the crime of rape, because it's because I take it so seriously that I am distressed by this trivialization. But I think if you care about victims, and you care about women and men, then you want an accurate view of reality. And this rape culture feminism is a distorted picture, and it now has victims. The victims are, it seems like every week now we have another case on our campuses of a young man that was put through what can only be described as a Kafkaesque procedure, kangaroo court. How am I doing? Do I have
1 minute?
Well, 1 minute. Yeah. I'll just tell you that this, as I said before, you take bad information, and history is one long lesson on the danger of combining misinformation and moral fervor. And you get fanaticism. If you have good information and you have moral energy, you get progress. But right now, we have fervor, we have panic, we have hysteria, I believe, and what this yields, this isn't going to yield solutions. This isn't going to help rape victims. If you want to help rape victims, the very top thing on your list should be, for example, rape kits and the police having better training and to stop this horrible crime. But when it's talking about campus, a campus like Oberlin College or Swarthmore, it's our most elite campuses where the women are most at fear and organized. And they are the safest places in the world, and these women are among the most self-determining and free women, and yet they are being taught that they are victims. And again, it's this combination of, it's propaganda and twisted theory. We do not live in a rape culture. We live in a free society, and bad things can happen, and they do happen to men and women, but we have to stop the panic. Thank you.
I'm going to ask a couple of very quick questions, and if you can just respond, you don't have to respond to my questions, but respond to anything you've heard on the panel, but just a couple of things that pique my interest. Firstly, Kaitlynn, I'd like to think about this idea that rape is becoming part of everyday life. And I think that's a very interesting claim, because do you recognise the risk that I think Ian hinted at, and one which I think I picked up on in doing some work on this topic, that if you see rape as part of everyday life, you detract from how serious rape is and how egregious it is. Do you see that as a risk of the rape culture position? And then for Christina, I'm interested in the word propaganda, because my instinct is to ask, well, propaganda for what? What's the cause? Ian, anything you want to come back on?
Yes, there is a bit, actually. And I'm going to put it sort of delicately. I mean, it's this stuff around, sort of rough sex and, and is there ever a context in which, rape porn, for instance, and all of this sort of cultural detritus around the issue. And I think that's part of a broader thing that it's always very, very difficult for us to talk about. But you see it, for instance, in the romance novel. So this is a very broad cultural trend of male power and male domination in sex. But, the romance novel is read for hundreds of years, always has the woman being seduced. So the man is taking on the active role of trying to get her to accept sex. In action films, you will never see a situation in which the two love interests are interested enough in each other at the beginning. Always the woman is resistant to the man at the beginning, and by the end of the film, the man has gotten her down to the point where he would talk. There is, and of course, my other job is with the Erotic Review, so we get sent a lot of sort of usually quite terrible sort of sexual stories. And I would say easily, among men and women, the most common sexual fancy is the male power fancy. It is not the only one. It's sort of like McDonald's. It's fine, but if you have it every single day, it's going to do your head in. But it is extremely common. And if we start saying that is just a fantasy that men have and not that women have, for instance, we get ourselves into the position where, this is going to be considered unacceptable. I thought the ban on rape porn was utterly disgraceful because it takes away women's consent. There was no claim that these were real rape videos. We already have laws against that stuff. This is about two people deciding that they want to shoot something. It's also about a husband and wife who choose to film themselves acting out sexual fantasies in the bedroom. The sexual fantasy is legal, but the video that is produced is illegal. And on the further end of that, we then see the criminalization of the BDSM community, which has happened again because of this impression that all sort of demonstrations of male sort of dominance in a sexual situation is necessarily removing the consent from the woman or is somehow dangerous or somehow encouraging rape in society. I don't accept any of those premises. The only thing that encourages rape in society is the prevalence of bastards and the lack of sex education that we have. So I think we need to be quite careful when we address these sort of topics to make sure that we don't start taking away, applying our real-world rules to the fantasy world, which looks nothing like the real world, and nor should it.
Great, thanks. Kaitlynn?
Yeah, sorry, just repeat your question.
Oh, my question, it was about whether or not the idea that rape is part of everyday life actually ends up detracting from how seriously we take rape and sexual assault and violence.
I don't think so. Maybe just kind of the comment I would say to respond to that is Jessica Valenti popularized this term, women live on a rape schedule. So we're kind of constantly aware that at any point, in theory, we could be raped. So this is where women walk with keys between our fingers at night, or we take certain precautions like making sure that you watch your drink or your friend watches your drink in case it gets spiked. I don't necessarily think that it means that, because we're aware that rape can happen, the stranger rape, I don't think it necessarily means that rape isn't taken as seriously.
Okay. Sue?
Well, 2 points. I suppose I owe half an apology to you, Ian, because you did make some good points about consent, but I just want to come back on the issue that as far as the law is concerned, consent is a very complex and a very difficult notion to negotiate in the courts. And historically, what is consent? What is consent? Consent is something that you do freely and you do of your total and own volition. And when I talk to students about consent, I say to my students, I don't think there is ever an occasion when I have said about anything in my life that I have truly consented. I'm trying to get the point across that we assent in our jobs, in our work, in everything we do to that encounter. So the notion that consent is something easy for the courts to deal with or for us to deal with, and we are in situations of subordination not always women, it can be men that are in situations of subordination, which mean that they assent because of economic, because of pressure, because of power, because of status, all kinds of issues. So the whole issue of consent, I think, is a very, very, very tricky one. And it's a tricky one for us in everyday life, and it's a very tricky one in the courts. And the narrative that you talk about, the BSM narrative, I mean, if people freely enter into a BSM situation, a situation of violence within their sexual encounter, that is fine. But it's going to be very difficult to actually distinguish those real consent issues from those where there is an issue of power. That narrative is coming more into the courtroom. Some of you will know about the Brown case in 1992 that went to the House of Lords, where there were men who indulged in sadomasochistic practices, which involved slicing skin off each other's penises, nailing scrotum to a board. I'm sorry, this is very early in the morning.
Sunday morning.
That was that factual narrative of the situation, and they all said they consented. And of course, one doesn't want to hunt and haunt any particular community that says we want to indulge in this kind of practice, but there were real concerns about whether some of those men actually really consented. That's my concern. We have a narrative now that is a much more popular narrative within the courts and within culture, from rough sex to sexual violence, and the argument is that the one who is the victim is actually consenting. And what I'm saying is, no, it's much more complex, and the courts are having difficulty in dealing with that, and we shouldn't trivialise the whole notion of consent.
Great, thank you, Sue. And Christina, anything you want to come back on?
You asked about the propaganda. I said before about these different theories of feminism, and I consider myself an egalitarian feminist. Sometimes I say equity feminist or freedom feminist. A freedom feminist is someone who wants for women what she wants for everyone, equal dignity and respect and freedom. But there was another school of feminism, which in my writings I've called gender feminism. And a gender feminist, it's short for the sex-gender system. They believe that women and men, but women bear the burden of this sex-gender system, that every institution in the society bears the impress of patriarchy, and it all must be interrogated to uncover these hidden, power dynamics in which women are held down. And there was one sex-gender feminist, Sandra Lee Bartke, a feminist philosopher, and she defined it. She said, we're all born bisexual, and then through socialization we're transformed into male and female human beings, one destined to command, the other to obey. I remember telling that to my husband, and he said, which commands, which obeys? But never mind. We're all destined. So there are women that believe that women have been initiated into this system where we are subordinate. And they will not give it up. The fact that women are now better educated than men, that women are in so many areas doing better and living longer for sure, and yet they still want to describe themselves as a victim class. We have colleges where women are approaching 60%, 64%, and they still have a women's center because women are held back and oppressed. I don't understand that. But because of that theory about the sex-gender system and these invisible forces, they needed the smoking gun. They needed data. So they eagerly grabbed on to these methodologies where you could suddenly find a hidden epidemic of predation, a hidden epidemic. 1 in 3 women battered, 1 in 4 victims of sexual assault. Naomi Wolf, at the height of this, which I thought was the height of it, but it seems to be coming back, in her book, The Beauty Myth, she said 150,000 women are dying every year from anorexia nervosa, a disease caused not by nature but by men. Those were her words. And there aren't 150,000 women dying of it. I mean, it was someone misread a brochure. I think they confused people that were suffering from eating disorders with annual deaths. I don't know, but it was an out of control piece of propaganda. Everyone grabbed onto it, and it became part. It was repeated along with these others. It's a kind of victim catechism. And it bothers me as a college professor. I see young women, they come into a college classroom, they're idealistic, they want to improve the world, and then they have professors, and in their textbooks, they read these victim statistics. They're actually hate statistics because they do engender anger and you take beautiful young women and turn them into bitter, suspicious creatures who don't trust men and who want to see the worst in men, and will take the worst case sociopathic male, and suddenly an Elliot Rodgers becomes emblematic for the male sex. These are the results of the propaganda. So I think maybe first was the theory, and then they looked for the facts.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, audience, hands go up. Okay.
Thank you for the debate, and also thank you for making it so civilised, because these debates often are not civilised.
There's still time.
And I think I've been following these debates for quite a while, and they get very emotional very often. But what really interests me is how each side, if that's the right word to use, would define what the debate's about. Is it about prevalence? Is it about the validity of statistics? Is it about, for example, whether the true number of women raped is 1 in 5 or 1 in 50? Or is it about the importance of these things in the wider context? Because when you notice these debates, what you find is that very often people agree on the facts, but they have very different emotional reactions to those facts. And one very interesting question is what underlies the different emotional reactions? You know, some people are accused of just dismissing the concerns of the other side accused the first side of dismissing their concerns. How do you really, if you want to be analytical about this, how do you really get to the bottom of what's going on? And then I suppose there are questions about the extent to which terms like rape are understood. Whether, for example, we say that rape is understood in a simple legal sense, sex without consent, or do we understand consent to be something much bigger? You know, you've got to consent truly, you've got to be in a free society where genders are equal and so on. So I suppose my interest is really to all sides. How is this, what's the debate really about?
I guess I'd like to interrogate the whole notion of the idea of rape culture, because it seems to me that if you say we live in a rape culture in the West, this is a complete travesty of what's actually happening to women in other parts of the world. I mean, look at the way Islamic State is treating women. That's rape culture. That's an unabashed celebration of criminality against women in the most, unimaginable way. I don't believe Susan Brown Miller, when she wrote Against Our Will, could have even imagined ISIS in the way it's behaving or is being reported as behaving. And it does seem to me there's a disconnect there, because actually I think women in the West are, comparatively speaking, incredibly free, incredibly privileged, and incredibly lucky. So perhaps we could interrogate that more.
I find this very frustrating in that I'm a student at university, and rape culture to me is walking from my home to the library any time of the day and someone catcalling, saying, hey, gorgeous, want to suck my cock? Sorry, by the way, I know it's early. And I say no, and they say, oh, you're a fat black bitch anyway. Okay, rape culture to me is when I spoke to a policeman, and he said, and I'm not even exaggerating, he said that women should not be surprised when these things happen if they've drank a bottle of wine before they go out at night, or they're wearing a short skirt. And Christina, I just want to say, I find it slightly ironic and amusing that you are, as a self-declared feminist, you use the term hysteria, given the historical connotations of that word, us women in our wandering wombs. And I just don't get why there is such this backlash against this culture, which, I'm sorry, it's real. I've spoken to my fellow students. It is a thing that happens, and I don't understand why there is such a backlash, why there's such a push against trying to raise awareness. And also, raising awareness does not trivialise the severity and the crime of what rape is. If anything, it gives people more strength to talk about it and recognise that it's really wrong.
Well, I think trivialization and panic are just two ends of the scales, and probably how we respond is the extent we ourselves as person are touched by the subject. Is that if someone is touched daily by it, it goes more into paranoia or panic. But if someone just looks at it from the outside and personally have never experienced that horror, that goes into trivialization. And the question of consent or no consent, because that's the other, I think, most important factor, if it actually exists, is just the question if we can actually look for the reasons. Because what we are normally looking at in a case is the present moment, and we never look at the reasons. So what I don't see, for example, is a representation of a psychotherapist here who would tell that most people who commit abuse or who are a victim of abuse. They are highly traumatized people.
Just a quick question on the statistics to start off with. So it's been said repeatedly on the panel that the same proportion of conviction rates are taking place now as they were back in the 1970s. I'm not a lawyer, I don't understand all the statistics or know all the statistics on this, but my understanding is that there are an awful lot more cases coming to court than there were in the 1970s. So if the proportion is remaining the same, but more cases are coming to court, then that means in numerical terms there are an awful lot more rape convictions taking place now than there were in the 1970s. It also suggests to me that there's a lot of convictions being put before courts that there's just no evidence, that there's not enough evidence to convict them. So that's the first point. I would just like to pose that as a question. Second thing kind of makes me quite angry. I've heard an awful lot about all women on the panel this morning. So all women feel pressured to respond to male entitlement. All women live on a rape schedule. All women do not enjoy rough sex. I'm kind of like, who are you people to speak on behalf of all women? Sorry, but unless you've actually been around and asked all women, you cannot do that. And all that this does is it promotes this fear, this panic. So the thing that alarmed me most, having a 9-year-old daughter and hearing you say, Sue, you know, we should worry about our daughters. Well, I do worry about my daughter. What I worry about is that she's going to become imbued with this absolute panic. And it's that complete disjuncture between what I'm hearing and the real world that people live in. I work on a university. It's absolutely bizarre to think that women are being catcalled on a university campus. You know, as people walk from the library to their bedrooms, this just does not happen. This is not reality the way that most people experience their lives. I think, unfortunately, Christina, one problem with what you said, there are victims of this rape culture. I actually think the biggest victims of this rape culture, though, are not the poor men, and I agree with you, there are men who get falsely accused. I think the biggest victims of this rape culture panic are women, because I speak to women on universities who do believe that they are too scared to leave their bedrooms because they will be raped walking from their bedrooms to the library. That is not going to happen. That is so completely untrue. And yet they have been imbued with this fear that they dare not leave their bedrooms after dark. And I think that is shocking. And I think that women who are going around perpetrating this panic, making women too scared to leave their bedrooms, really have an awful lot to feel responsible for.
Correct.
I just wanted to ask what the solution is to these problems. We've heard about the statistics and the misrepresentation of truth and the politics and the multi-million-pound industry behind it. What is the solution?
I think part of the problem is that the use of the word rape is very wide, and it's much more nuanced. It's much more nuanced than that. There are lots of rape in war is an act of violence. When we're talking about people who are out on a night out and have had too much to drink and things get out of hand, I don't think that's the same thing. And I think when you lump everything together, you can get very confused. And that confusion leads to panic.
I've got a question for everyone on the panel, particularly for Sue. At one point, I believe that you said that you've never fully, freely consented to anything in your life. If that's the case, then it seems to me that under your own sort of definition, that any man who's ever had sex with you has raped you. And a question that I would like to further ask is if you take the view that women can't consent, what problems does this have for the legal situation in general? And moreover, my understanding of some feminist philosophy is that the whole legal system is deemed by some feminists to be set up by a patriarchal society in favour of men, and this is why men are not being convicted, that women are not being believed in courts. And it seems to me that they want to change, or potentially change, the whole basis of innocent until proven guilty, to guilty unless proven innocent, that the starting point should not be that the accused is innocent, but that the woman is believed. And I wonder if any people on the panel can comment on this.
I wanted to go back to a point that was raised during the consent session yesterday, which I think Luke raised it, which is he said that he thinks that what we have is a problem not with sex, but a problem with intimacy. And in my own research, I've gone and I've read accounts of rape accusations on American college campuses now, and you read them, and some of them clearly are sexual assaults. I think most people would agree, but a lot of them are just bad sex. I felt manipulated. He was mean to me, and a lot of them are sort of retrospectively reimagined as I've been raped. And I guess the thing I wanted to raise is that I think part of the problem and why this is more current now is I think the current generation of students have a real problem with risk. And I think that risk is inherent in intimacy. You always take a risk when you become intimate with somebody. And the reality is that, sometimes it's not going to work out. So, in some ways, the definition of college sex is that it's bad sex because you're taking risks. And, and it's not always, beautiful or, ongoing or, so it seems to me that perhaps it's that reluctance to take a risk. And just the last thing is, it's very different because for my generation, we had a lot of bad sex, and we took risks. And but the thing was that taking risks is an adult thing to do. It's part of becoming an adult. And so even though you had bad experiences along the way, they were experiences that you willingly entered into as an adult, and that was exhilarating. And I just find it a very different mindset.
I think we do live in a rape culture, and I wanted to comment that saying that other countries it's worse, we're actually better off. That doesn't mean things are good here. If a rape happens anywhere, it's bad. And I think that goes with the numbers. Do the numbers really matter? 1 in 5, 1 in 50, it's still bad. And also, I'm surprised that none of the people really touched upon on males being the victims. And, you've got with sort of prison rape jokes, how many times have people heard, oh, don't drop the soap? And it's seen as funny, and it's not seen as sort of as serious as a woman being raped. And it is rape. There's also like fraping with Facebook. Should that word be used in such a trivial sense? So we need to define what rape is, define how we can sort out when consent does become blurred. And also, I know Ian mentioned that consent classes weren't the answer, but you mentioned that sex education was important. Well, what about starting teaching consent from a very young age? Forget about sexual consent, teach it with intimate consent, relate, general consent to be a decent human being. And I did disagree with the thing that you've got to, it's the bastards you're looking out for, whereas actually I think everyone can be a victim of not understanding how to be intimate.
I think you just need to look at what's happening in the press with Jana, Proctor and Britain to see what the establishment does to cover up child abuse and consent issues. It defends its own. These are powerful people. They use the words, like these poor old men, lurid, unspeakable allegations that, almost say more about the people claiming them than they do the actual assault itself. I see this written in Spiked. I see this in the Times regularly, and I hear it from various people in this room. And I've had enough of it. It's disgusting. We need access to justice. That's the way you're going to control this so-called mob.
I'm going to come back to the panel, and I'm going to take it in reverse order if I can. Christina, is there anything you want to come back on?
So many things. Okay. The first thing I'll say is this whole idea of consent and then regulating that in law courts is so misguided because it is metaphysically impossible to know what goes on between two people when there are no witnesses. And even if she did, I say she, it could be he, but even if she did consent, she can withdraw the consent. And that would matter. And in some cases, that could be an attack. We don't know. So we have these he said, she said cases. And now in the United States, what's happened is they've brought in this yes means yes and these consent laws. And the lowest standard of proof on campus, a preponderance of evidence rather than beyond a reasonable doubt or, you can be found guilty. Now, a young man typically will be found guilty on this very low standard. If there's more than a 50% chance he did it, and then you add that to this view that some have that women don't lie about rape, which they do, not because they're women, because they're human, and people lie, especially about sex, but never mind that. We've got these courts and this terrible injustice, and then this idea that we can regulate this unhappiness and this misery, we can regulate it out of our lives. You can't. You have to try your best, and you have to try your best to protect women and men from victimization while not becoming a police state and with respect for the due process. And it's almost as if in these discussions people forget that. They think, well, this, and I think it's because of the theories and they think it's an epidemic out of control. All women live on a rape schedule. I don't even know what that means. And the men in this room are far more likely to be beaten up and murdered than women. And do they live on a murder schedule? Do they live, what does that even mean? So I just this language, and when we were free, fortunate people in a society where no one can be 100% safe, but we're safer than almost anybody in history, and certainly women are more self-determining today. And then finally, I'll say, again, going back to what you were talking about earlier, I think about those sorts of books that women like. It's not men who buy these bodice rippers and romance novels. It's women. It's women who bought 50 Shades of Grey. And so that's the sexual imagination. And you don't want to police that either. So I do see this as a repressive movement, and I urge you, if you've been taken in by it, is to read a little more. And then when someone asked about solutions, I think there are two issues. We need a solution. We're never going to have an absolute solution to crime, to violent crime and horrible crime. We have to do our best in the ways that I said before. But I think about the rape culture, the fact that it doesn't exist. The solution is that we need more diversity, intellectual diversity on our campuses. And the skeptics like myself, we were silenced. And the women's movement talks about, women's voices being silenced. Yeah, by a lot of feminists. So if you're a dissident feminist, and I just wish that when young women come into their freshman classes, in my ideal university, there would be radical feminists. I think we can learn. I have learned from radical feminists. Even Catherine McKinnon is a brilliant woman. I just disagree with 90% of what she says, but there's 10% that I find engaging and interesting. So she can have a place, but then I want the counterpoise, and I want someone who's reality-based to counter her. And you haven't had that. And I'm telling you with all the sincerity I can muster, if you believe you live in a rape culture, you need, this sounds rude, but a little deprogramming. This is not true. It's not a reality. And
Sue.
Can I thank you at the front for framing, I think, so wonderfully framing the whole question, I think, I mean, at least for me, and I hope for the debate, that is it about prevalence, is it about statistics, is it about conviction rates, or is it really about the representation of women, but not always women, within our culture and sexual violence? And if I can just take the two questions, that the lady who spoke so eloquently, who's also teaching in a university, I'm not suggesting factually or didactically that 9-year-olds, your daughter or my mother, or should absolutely fear rape. What I'm saying is that all women, regardless of their age, are represented within culture in a certain way. So in fact, I'm speaking to both of the points. The whole question about rape and the reality of rape as we understand it in the culture, but also the way in which women are represented within culture. And if I can just take the point that it was directed at me on the issue of consent, again, I was using consent provocatively to ask people to ask themselves, what is the nature of consent in your life, and how difficult must it be for consent to be interpreted within a courtroom scenario? So I was talking metaphorically, but can I just move on very quickly to a very important question and comment that was put from the lady at the front about how we should be raising our consciousnesses about taking this debate, whilst not saying it doesn't exist here, rape doesn't exist, nor the violent representation of women, the sexualised representation of women within the culture across all forms of media. The whole point that ISIS today and Syria today, these are absolutely real matters. I would say in response to what's happening to women in Syria today, that in fact it's happening to men, it's happening of course to the Shia, it's happening also to Sunni who disagree, it's happening to Christians, and that is rape and that is mutilation of all kinds. But the important point I know that you raised when you mentioned Susan Brownmiller, and that Susan Brownmiller, who wrote Against Our Will in 1975, couldn't possibly imagine what's being faced today. I think what is significant, and I'll end on this before the red card comes up, and ending on this is to say that, you know, we had many rapes. Rape was used as an instrument of war, and we all know that. And it was used as an instrument of war in Serbia, in Rwanda, it's being used in Syria. But the important thing that we need to take away with is that it wasn't until 2000 that international criminal law recognised rape as a crime of humanity, because it didn't matter. And journalists in Syria said, how many more women do you want raped? Said this to the Western world. How many more women do you want raped? Do you want 10,000? Do you want 20,000? Before the international community recognises that rape was being used, but not just against women, against men as an instrument of war. And we have to ask ourselves why it took so long for us to recognise this with international
Thank you,
circles.
Sue. Sorry, don't mean to cut you off. Kaitlynn.
Yeah, maybe just my point is to kind of reiterate the point that I made, that rape culture is not just about rape and sexual assault. I think living in a rape culture means that we live in this world where sexual harassment, street harassment, the general trivialization of rape, for example, through rape jokes, through these kind of like offensive, misogynistic content, web pages that exist, is very real. Now, you're right. Okay, once again, the point about there are women in other countries who are experiencing lots of horrors that women in the West don't experience, but that doesn't mean that these other practices don't have very real harmful consequences for women. There's lots of evidence in my own research, for example, that shows that, you know, I no longer walk a certain way to work because I know that I'm going to be harassed constantly. I no longer wear certain types of clothing because, once again, it brings certain type of attention that I don't like. So it has negative consequences. It has real consequences for women's lives. And I think to dismiss it and to say that rape culture isn't real, that it's not a problem on campus, is just, it's wrong and it's ignorant. And, you know, we can debate about the statistics, but it doesn't matter, I think, once again, if it's 1 in 50, 1 in 4. It is a problem, and it is something, I think, that all women know what it's like to live in a rape culture where sexual harassment is a problem, where they have a fear, where women are constantly aware that, yes, I might be raped at any point, and it won't necessarily, probably if you are raped, it's not going to be by the stranger in the street. It's going to be by someone that you know, someone that you trust, and probably in a space that you perhaps feel comfortable, your home, their home, a potentially safe space. So I'll finish there.
Just very quickly, I'm intrigued by that, because that seems to undermine the rape culture argument, doesn't it? That you're more likely to be raped by someone who's close to you, who will take advantage in an opportunistic setting, but yet all men are potentially triggered into rape by the interaction with culture. Is there a contradiction there or not?
Sorry, that men are triggered into rape by...
Well, the suggestion of the rape culture argument is that men are, you know, rape because they interact with misogynistic culture. Well, at least that's the argument that's made. But that seems to be undermined by the suggestion that, and the truth, that rape is more likely to be committed by someone who's in an opportunistic setting, in an intimate setting. So
Yeah,
do you see a contradiction there or not?
I don't think so. I mean, just if I understand your point correctly, you know, anyone is capable of engaging in rape, and I don't think it's just misogynists who rape. Nice guys rape too, and this is the problem we have when we don't believe that Bill Cosby could be a rapist, that Jimmy Savile could be a rapist, because it's not just kind of blatant misogynist who everyone says he hates women, he's going to rape women. Any person. And I think part of it is entitlement. I think there are kind of these blurred lines about entitlement.
Yeah, great. And Ian?
So just on the solutions thing, and I'm going to be fairly boring, actually, with the solution. I mean, I hate it whenever anyone says this, but it happens to be true in this case. It has to be education. And it's a very long-term thing, and actually that goes on both sides. So firstly, that is about, as you're alluding to, sort of, you know, describing the ways of sort of trying to defeat victim blaming, explaining to women exactly where consent starts on the smallest and the largest matters. But it is also there, I think, I'm not as sanguine as some of my libertarian allies on the role of pornography in the formation of the teenage sexual mind. So I think for adults it needs to be protected, it is an expression of our fantasies. And yet, for when kids come to it, 14-year-old kids, 13-year-old boys, their first introduction to the sexual world is now through usually quite aggressive pornography. I don't think that they're in a position developmentally, to be able to see the distinction between fantasy and reality. And as long as we keep on dragging our heels on sexual education in school, which should be as broad as humanly possible, we are going to keep on finding these problems later on. I think that also goes, by the way, for telling women what it is like when you report rape. There is an idea that it is still as it was in the 1970s and 1980s. In fact, there's been a quite significant improvement in the way that police treat those situations. And it'd be nice if women had a better, clearer idea of how that would work, and that it doesn't have to be this utter horror story that they may imagine it could be. Education for adults, I think that stops by the time we get to 18. When we go into college, I've already said, I think that the consent classes are a problem. But there's something else there as well, which is as soon as, say, I don't know if you guys remember, about 5 years ago, Ken Clark very inelegantly sort of made this point around more serious rapes and less serious rapes in terms of how we would come up with charging. Now, he made it very inelegantly and unwisely. The point he was making was not unsound, and of course something that would be taken into consideration at the point of charge, that, if there was violence or if there was kidnapping or something, of course there's going to be a more severe sentence. But the response to him, this shouting of rape is rape and we close down the issue, actually I think serves to de-educate adults as to the discussion. So that women themselves who have suffered something that would happen on a one-night stand, the drunken, regrettable sex, actually would be less able to think of that was rape, because to them rape is this sort of unanalyzed space where it's the most severe examples. But I do want to put a note of caution on all of that I just said, which is that we are dealing with a crime which is very specific. And it is specific in the sense that it typically has no witnesses. And that is something that we are never going to get over in rape. That's why we find ourselves coming up with these suggestions of, should we flip the need to prove innocence and guilt in the case of these cases? Because usually speaking, everyone agrees that the sex took place. There was only two people in the room, one of whom is the defendant, the other person is the victim, and they both have different assessments of how that situation took place. And that, unfortunately, is something that it is very difficult for us to deal with in a court of law, and that is just a true thing where our adversarial system, which has an onus on innocence, actually finds it very hard to deal with these situations. It's impressive that we have the convictions up to the point where they are equivalent to burglary, actually. And actually, it's a kind of a problem that we are going to struggle to get past.
Great. Right, I'm going to come back out to the audience.
Could the panel agree that sex is sex, rape is rape, and when sex is rape, it's no longer sex? Because I think what's happened here, and I'm trying to explain to myself why young women at the cusp of going out into the world find it so appealing to take on board as an article of faith the idea that they are very, very likely to be raped. The only time I've ever been attacked in my life, I survived a campus, I've survived the streets of London, I was attacked by a bunch of girls who stole my bag. That's much more likely to happen to you. And I drew no conclusions from the fact that they were a bunch of black girls. I drew no conclusions from that. I didn't tell everybody else that they had to then be careful of a bunch of black girls. I didn't then report it. I didn't bother because my bag was empty. I was poor. So why is there such an appeal of this to young women? I just don't get it. And I think that, Ian, you're completely wrong on sex education. These young women are the product of sex education as it currently is. They are arguing for the kind of sex education that you are saying isn't happening. It is happening. If you look at the kind of people that advocate modern style or kind of informed or sort of sexy sex education, this is exactly what they're talking about. Consent training. That's what they're talking about, introducing at the youngest possible age. So stop arguing for sex education because these people are the product of it.
Okay.
Thanks. I wanted to press you further on sex education as well, Ian, because your argument to me seems very peculiar. It appears to be almost contending that the reason why some boys become rapists as men had something to do with the inadequacies of sex education, which seems to me to be the most peculiar, strange account that you could give of why a rapist rapes. I don't think it has anything to do with the absence or presence of sex education. And I think to create some kind of generalised connection between rapists and boys and school in this way is very, very peculiar. On your point about pornography, My argument would be is that the most important thing that teenagers need to do, as much as possible, is have more to do with each other in reality. We need more teenage sex. We need teenagers really, genuinely getting off with each other much more, making mistakes, fumbling, and having bad experiences, because then they would learn reality and they wouldn't be so confused about pornography. And I think it is perfectly plausible to argue that precisely the reason why so many boys are spending time looking at pornography more and more is because they aren't having enough sex with actual girls. Oh, and by the way, when it comes to rape, a very big issue here is the fact that a 17-year-old boy can be charged with statutory rape for having sex with a 15-year-old girl. So if you really want to do something about it, we should have a big discussion about the problem of the age of consent.
Just looking at the wider context of this, I'm going to pick up on a couple of panelists have used the word regularly, misogyny. There is no scientific evidence whatsoever that it's a completely mythical feminist term. There's misandry. That's the basis of all social systems. And the use of the term misogyny is itself misandry. So the whole concentration focus on rape really is a subset of all this. And if you look again more widely in terms of violence against women, I'm the author of 3 major review papers on intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And all the evidence converges showing that actually women are more likely to perpetrate domestic violence than are males. And in particular, there's a lot of recent research showing that if you look in a couple context, the preferred mode of aggression by women is actually physical violence, whereas in any context where a female will be the target, men, that is normal men, back away. So the whole wider context of feminist theory is completely up a gum tree.
Thanks. One of the ideas that's been raised again and again is this idea of men's, particularly young men's, sense of entitlement to women's bodies. I mean, personally, I find that to be completely a bizarre idea. As a young man growing up, the idea of feeling entitled to women's bodies, and I feel that's very much the case in the milieu that I've hung around with, which is very, very broad, from building sites to universities. I feel that, you know, the kind of dynamic of men having to, in fact, often prove themselves and having to sort of prove their worth inherently before becoming something that's, you know, worthy of interest for women is very much a trope in the popular culture, certainly as much as the idea of men having some kind of sense of entitlement. I recently went, and I feel that this is a kind of an idea which is expressed and in sort of young men are spoken about as if they are like this, and I wonder where this idea comes from, because it simply doesn't chime with my lived experience and the lived experience of the young men that I know. I recently went to, just very quickly, sorry. I recently went to a school where they were actually conducting a consent, or not consent class, a kind of a gender education class, which is a feminist education class. And the boys were coming out, young boys, with incredibly even-handed, egalitarian ideas, and they simply... One of the teachers after essentially said, yeah, well, they'll come out with these ideas, but if you scratch the surface, they're really sexist underneath.
Okay, excuse my English, it's not my first language, but I do my best. I'm afraid that you're not facing structural or cultural aspects very much yet. Well, some of you are, but not all. I have a question especially for Ian. That's your name? Yeah. You refer to men who rape women as bastards. So how do these men you refer to as bastards become bastards? And what can we do about it? According to the statistics, also from the country where I come from, Finland, you have quite a lot of those bastards. And also, do not forget that rape is always an act of power, and it shouldn't be individualized or psychologized either. Also, some of you here, even feminists, seem to suggest that women are misusing the system, those sneaky women. Then again, a question, culturally speaking, what is it an outcome of if some women misuse the system by false accusations? I'd like to have an answer for that.
Hi, I wanted to come back on the student at the front who described her trip from the bedroom to the library. Basically, you seem to be synonymizing rape culture with the existence of rape, because you gave as evidence that, you know, we live in a rape culture, the existence of sexually menacing behavior or of rape, you know, happening. Nobody's disputing that. The point is, for us to live in a rape culture, for a descriptor or a characterization to make sense, it has to be comparative. We have to know, if we live in a rape culture, what is a non-rape culture, or where is this non-rape culture? Because a lot of the time, the proponents of the theory seem to be casting rose-tinted spectacles either back to some golden age where women were in less danger, which never happened, or to some El Dorado location elsewhere where women are safer, which actually, for most of the world, is also dramatically not the case. So for there to be a problem with rape or for rape to exist is not up for dispute. It's whether or not we live in a characterisably rape culture as compared to time and space elsewhere, basically.
Yeah, in the interests of correcting misinformation, I feel duty-bound to say something about the conviction rate, which Susan mentioned a couple of times. The conviction rate for rape is actually high. It's not the highest of all crimes. Murder's higher, but it's in the top end. It's far, far higher than burglary. It's not infinitely higher, but it's much, much higher than the rate for burglary, obviously because so many burglars aren't caught. And you just need to look at the work of Cheryl Thomas to see that really, Professor Cheryl Thomas, to see that really well evidenced. I don't doubt, and I'm sort of expanding on the point that was made earlier, I don't doubt that it might be the case that the conviction rate is the same as it was in the 70s, but of course, as was said, we have far fewer cases there, and we also have very different cases. So we have, stranger rape cases in the 70s. We've had a massive increase in acquaintance rape, date rape, for the reasons that people have talked about. So it's perhaps not surprising that the conviction rate, has stayed the same, because the cases brought now are so much more numerous, and they're also more difficult to prove for the reasons that have been outlined. So let's not start a panic about the conviction rate, which is high compared with other crimes.
I just wanted to ask, would you guys agree with the idea that because we kind of do live in a rape culture, I think, because every day I see, not just women, I see people's bodies being sexualised in TV, in media, in game content, anything. But I think what also worries me is when we talk about education as well, I think it's not education and consent that we need, it's education and humanity. I'm 15, I have been catcalled numerous times wearing clothes like I'm wearing now, and even if being blamed on what you're wearing was a thing, I just don't think that's quite right. So maybe what we actually need to do is teach people that people are people and we all have our own rights. So maybe if we taught our young men and women, not that they need consent, but that they need to listen to other people's wishes just because that is the right thing to do. Because we all have humanity, and when that humanity is taken away, it is a crime.
This is to Christina. It's really hard to collect figures for rape and sexual assault because victims don't usually come forwards because it's stressful, it's scary, there's lots of things that stop them coming forwards. But I can tell you that 21 people who are close to me have been raped. And these are people who are my age, these are people younger than me, these are people older than me, these are people who live all over London, these are girls, these are boys. And 100% of the girls I have asked have been sexually assaulted at some point in their life, be this groped by a stranger or anything considered more severe. So do not try and say that this is not a pandemic. This is a massive issue, and it is on a very large scale.
I think maybe the feeling that, or the reason why lots of more young people feel like they're being harassed or shamed and is that they're now interpreting behavior that didn't used to be interpreted as violent or insulting or degrading. They're interpreting it in that light now, and perhaps it's leading to a definition of occurrences and behavior that used to be quite normal into something very serious and shameful. And perhaps that's why we're hearing that all of these phenomena are on the rise.
Christina, you're a heroine, and I love you. Kaitlynn, really early on, you said that many or even most men don't feel entitled to women's bodies and their time. So surely what you're saying is that there's not a rape culture. Most men don't feel, that it's socially acceptable, and the problem is actually with Ian's bastards. And then finally, on rape jokes, I believe that they're funny because everybody knows it's wrong, and so it's outrageous and shocking to use it in a trivialised context.
I think there's been a shifting of ground on the part of Sue and Kaitlynn during this discussion. I'm a little bit confused. So I think you started off saying there's a sexualised culture, and the problem is this leads to a high prevalence of rape. You've then been challenged on the statistics and said, well, actually, maybe it's just the existence of rape that's a problem, but actually it's the sexualised culture that's the problem. So where does your beef actually lie?
Panel, you have 1 minute to make your point, and we're going to take it in the same order as we started. So, Ian, 1 minute.
Good. Well, first of all, I'm very glad that I've coined the term Ian's Bastards. I'm going to take that home.
It's quite a good band name, I thought.
Yeah. All my memoirs. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, look, just to address this education thing, I think, because I got asked it directly. I think that if you're going to adopt a libertarian position for adults, you need to take a quite authoritarian position with children, so they can be developmentally at the stage where they can make informed choices without the interference of the state or anybody else later on. In the question of rape, this is particularly important, not just because victim blaming, by the way, victim blaming isn't just a thing with rape. I mean, we do it all the time across the range of human behaviors. It's much easier to blame the person who is the victim because they're typically speaking the weaker party and we get to side with the strong, and that's a very tempting psychological response, particularly pernicious in rape. Because very often it's in a friendship group where one person in the friendship group is being blamed, or it's an ex-boyfriend or a boyfriend, where the friends are going to turn against the person because they don't want to think ill of him. On the pornography issue, I mean, the causal relationship between pornography and sexual assault is, if anything, in a very minor way, negative. It seems that where you introduce it, there may be a very small decrease in sexual assaults. However, we are in a situation where, for the first time, young people are being introduced to an extraordinarily varied and prolific amount of quite aggressive pornography at a very young age. And I think it would be foolish of us not to think that it's very important that they get some consent training or some appreciation that what they're seeing is fantasy rather than reality.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Kaitlynn.
Okay, maybe to address the specific point of has my ground changed? No, it hasn't. I think my overall argument is that rape culture doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who catcalls, everyone who engages in sexual harassment, everyone who tells a rape joke is going to go out and rape someone. Okay, so I think that those are two different incidences. Living in a rape culture means rape and sexual assault happens, but it's about this wider range of practice which I think we need to recognize, and we are increasingly recognized as harmful. And that brings me to another point. A speaker at the back mentioned about how it's this reframing of everyday practices which were quite normal. You know, even up until a few years ago, you know, street harassment wasn't considered a problem. It was, you know, it was just something women accepted, and women perhaps didn't even have this word for it. Just like sexual harassment until the 1970s, you know, this sort of behavior was common, but there wasn't a word to describe it. There wasn't kind of a way of understanding the way that it's problematic. About rape jokes, I think that there are different types of rape jokes. You're right, humor can be used as a really great way to talk about, deal with some really horrible things that happen in life. But I think there's a difference between, hey, everybody, let's gang rape this woman here, and, you know, differences making a joke about the absurdity of the fact that we live in a world where rape happens.
Great, thank you. Sue?
1 minute. Thank you very much to the 15-year-old woman or girl or adolescent, depending on where the law puts you. But thank you. You have given us a clarion call to humanity, which is really what we should be doing when we say what is to be done, and it's about dignity and worth of each and every individual. So thank you very much for that. My major point here is not so much arguing about the conviction rate, but I would like to speak to the various people who've talked about the conviction rate, whether it's higher or lower, and how much of the conviction rate actually includes those who plead guilty, which means that the conviction rate is very deceptive, because we think it's about those who've actually been found guilty by jurors. We could talk about that, but my main point is about sexual scripts within society and the representation of women within society. As to the numbers, how many more, less, if we look at the murder statistics, 20%, nearly 20% of all women who are killed, these are female partners, let me rephrase that, 20% of the whole murder rate involves women who are killed by male partners. Every woman counts, every woman counts, every woman victim counts. In fact, every male victim counts as well. So I want to make that clear. So my point is really, what are we to do? And I go back to the 15-year-old, thank you. And I think we should take much more moral responsibility. We should complain about adverts. We should be on the red carpet, not just about suffragette, but every film that depicts women and men in a sexualized way that is derogatory, that debases them, that humiliates them, that harms them. That's what we should be doing here. We should be taking to the streets. We should be involved in direct confrontational action. And we're not. There's a kind of apathy. I don't agree that pornography is fantasy. Pornography is real, and red card is coming up. So pornography, and I don't agree that it doesn't have very much of an impact. It has a very significant impact. And if we do anything today, we should go out and challenge all those sexually violent, harmful, hurtful representations which do feed into what we do. Why is it that the advertising industry spends billions of pounds of dollars on adverts if what you see doesn't affect what you do?
Great, thanks, Sue.
Thank you.
Just a quick point of fact, the jury conviction rate being the percentage of cases where juries retire and consider their verdicts is also very high. So they convict in more cases than they acquit, which is something that most people don't know. But Christina.
Well, as a result of this panel, I'm now beginning to think that another word for rape culture is actually a free culture. And they are defining everything that can happen in a free society. Yes, people will tell off-color jokes. People will sexualize bodies. There will be sexiness. There will be, all sorts of comments in the street. Now, if you are in a society that's highly puritanical or authoritarian, they can control these things. But in a free society, it happens. And some people object to it and others don't. People are various. Women are not a monolithic group, nor are men. And you have to acknowledge that. And this, to me, is a kind of totalitarian worldview where we have this conspiracy theory and everything is feeding into women's subordinate status as victims of a rape culture. This is madness. It's madness. It is. Now, having said that, I'm going to take a different tone and go back to my original. Before I was bickering with feminists, I was a professor of ethics and philosophy, and I strongly believe in not sex education, yes, but more moral education in the home. You do have to raise your children to be considerate, loving human beings, and to respect other people. That's foundational, and without that, we're all lost. And we see, young men that are insufficiently socialized, that are raised without father figures. It puts it at greater risk. And again, I think if we had a more serious discussion, not a fantasy discussion about a rape culture that doesn't exist, but the real world, we would be talking more about stabilizing families, about educating children to be ethical human beings, and sort of straightforward approach to life. But we're not there now. We've been taken to a fantasy land, and I hope we come back to reality soon. Thank you.
Can we thank our panel?